Hey, thank you so much, everyone, for joining. There's lots of people still joining, but we might kick off. If we jump across to the next slide, I'll do some introductions. Oh, no, I won't. I'll do some housekeeping. That's really important. So we want this to be an interactive webinar. And so we would love to hear where everyone's from and tell us a bit about yourself in the webinar chat. But if you do have any questions, please use the Q&A function in the webinar. That way, if any questions we don't get to in the webinar, we can collate those, get answers to them, and share those with you post-webinar. So please tell us about yourself in the chat, but use the Q&A function for questions, and I'll be manning that in the background. This will be recorded, so if you do have any colleagues that have been caught up and aren't able to make it, we will be sharing this with everyone who registered post the webinar, and it'll also be available on our YouTube channel. Thanks, Tris. Jump onto the next slide. So today's host, you've got myself, Neil, Sales Operations Manager here at ShiftCare, and we've got the amazing Tris Peters from QuickClaim. We've got the amazing Siobhan Simpson from Stuart Brown, and Matt Cagney, the CEO of ShiftCare, and Matt Armstrong is in the background with me on the chat. He's a partnerships manager with ShiftCare. But without any further ado, Tris, I'll pass over to you.
Thank you, Neil. Look, it's a pleasure to be here today and try to, with the expertise of Siobhan and Matthew, unravel some of the complexity that is the pricing arrangements and price limits for 2025, 2026. We're particularly keen to look at the sort of processes and systems you can put in place to ensure that the transition is a smooth one, so that you can, at the end of the day, claim with confidence and make sure that you're supporting your participants to the best of your abilities. So there is a lot to get through, so let's dive straight into it. So Matthew, I'm going to throw to you first. We've seen some obviously big changes to the price limits as part of the most recent paper, with both price freezes and price limit decreases. What are some of the most notable that you've picked out?
Look, yeah. Look, I know there's mixed views here, but my glass is always half full, slightly overflowing. So I tend to look at one of the ones that I'm quite happy about is early childhood intervention. You know, raising the age from 7 to 9. I think that's a really great change. We all know that early intervention does make one heck of a difference, and I'm glad to see that they've increased that from 7 to 9. I think that really makes a big difference. Then, as someone who consumes a lot of NDIS services for my daughter, I'm also quite happy to see, and this might be controversial, but there's a bit of a cap on provider travel. I think, you know, I see a lot of bills coming through, and I think the provider travel sometimes can be overclaimed. I know that might be quite contentious, but that's one that I think potentially had to happen. And I think so. They're probably the two real big ones for me. Plus, obviously, the disability support workers get a slight bump in salary, which is a great thing for those core people out there. Not everybody's happy, not everybody's happy, and there's winners and losers in everything. So I'll hand across to Siobhan for her probably more fulsome view on some of the price changes.
I think, look, we weren't expecting miracles. So it was always predicted that this would be, for the majority of services, circling the airport uplift. And that's what it is. It covers the SHADS increases, the minimum wage 3.5 for the modern awards. It covers superannuation for the bulk of providers. But there are extenuating circumstances for sort of smaller activities within the broader disability space. Plan managers have been hit with the removal of one of their funding streams. Their sort of onboarding cost has gone. Support coordination for the bulk hasn't received an uplift, and they're looking at the last 5 years of no uplifts. And allied health, from a provider perspective, from a funding and a viability perspective, rather than a participant, I suppose, if I just look at it from a financial operational point of view, those are quite hard hits for them in their costing structure. So the loss of 50% of the travel, the shift in those variances across state-based rates. So some states have been hit harder in the allied health space than others for this. So we are seeing, for providers, potentially it's a business as usual for most, but that business as usual is still very, very, very lean when you break the model down. And then in that allied health space, the therapy space in particular, you're seeing those fundamental shifts for them in how, I suppose what was previously maybe subsidizing other areas is now gone. So those impacts, I hate to say, I'll be interested to see how they go, because God, isn't that such a privileged position to be from the outside? But I know there's a lot of concern for providers, particularly in allied health. Plan manager concern as well, but they've been making money. So I think a lot of people are a bit less sympathetic with that change. But we have to look at it through the lens of what could be happening with the Navigator future, and a potential loss of that knowledge as we shift into, this 5-year timeline. So all in all, it is what was expected for the bulk. So 3.5, 50% for super. It does not address some of the issues in the model itself. And that for a lot of people is problematic, but you have to have patience with a shift like this, with a change, with what's needed to be changed with the model. So allied health, I put in one bucket and say they're hurting from these, and everyone else, it is status quo. That status quo is difficult. So that's sort of how I see it through the lens of viability more broadly for organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned plan management there. One of the justifications for the removal of that setup fee was the NDIS stating that the market had reached maturity. Do you think that the market has reached maturity, or is this just sort of political speak to justify some of the decisions that have been made?
I personally, and I'm not an economist, which I always say, and then sometimes I end up talking to economists, or like unbeknownst to myself, and they're like, well, you're trying to be one. I'm like, no. I just like big words. I don't think you can actually make any characteristic judgment about this market. Like, that is the problem with it. How do we know if it's mature when you've got 270 plus thousand providers in the space? If market failure is an indicator of the market maturity, we are starting to see that with significant providers just closing their doors. We had an Ecto in Victoria basically almost shut overnight, just stop providing services. An 80-year-old organization. I think they had about 40 million in NDIS funding. So the merger and acquisition space, the falling over of organizations, potentially that is indicative of market failure, and maybe that's where this market maturation is coming from. But as I said, with a market that size, I don't know how you could make any commentary on it. You've also got significant large providers. Like, it's almost an atomized market in terms of its size. You've got huge numbers of small, like the data itself says on average, there's, I think, 2.4 participants for every provider. When you think about that, it's wild. So yeah, maybe it is maybe they've got the data to back it up. I don't know. What I do know is it's a very, very unorthodox market in comparison with the other health spaces in Australia.
Yeah. And I sorry, Matthew.
There was a couple of Yvonne has just sort of mentioned that, obviously with the provider travel getting reduced, setting that cap, that she's expecting, and the industry's expecting more non-face-to-face claims, which means is the cost is changing quite significantly. So any commentary around that specific aspect?
As in for allied health providers to lean into the non-face. That was always going to be something that's always having to be done. And this element of ensuring that your utilization is where it absolutely has to be. Now, it's a little bit more difficult with allied health to mark out where your utilization is, because you don't have the triggers that you have in all of the others, because we're told by the DSW cost model, utilization in the bulk of services needs to be 92%. With allied health, we don't have that statistic. So what I see in allied health is utilization, sitting between 65% generally for providers that are, sort of breaking even, making a bit of money, can go up to 75%, but it completely depends on your scale, scope, size, and the service provision. Because within allied health, you have a wide range of service provision as well. But that idea of absolutely maximizing within the confines and within your service agreement, the billable non-face-to-face is going to be extremely important. But ultimately, it all steps into the issue of utilization as a whole. So how you focus and measure utilization at a time when, for some allied health professionals, a huge amount of their margin has just been cut. So you have to take that more holistic step back and go, absolutely, we've got to eke out as much service provision at the most efficient way as possible. But what is our entire envelope from a utilization point of view?
Really keen to pick up that conversation around margins a little bit further on within this webinar. But in terms of those sort of practical implications of the new PAPL then, Siobhan, what sort of timeline are providers playing with to update service agreements and pricing across sort of all participants? How do we sort of manage this transition for providers?
So this is an interesting one. I met a provider, it was about 12 months ago, and they had come to the realization that they had forgotten to uplift for an entire year. They hadn't shifted their pricing. Participant plans had gone up by the indexation. Their pricing had not gone up. And that was through an internal control issue, that they didn't have the triggers and the flags and whatever was required to go in. And when the PAPL gets released, which we were given a little bit more time this year, but when it gets released, to uplift. So you are entitled to bill. And in some cases, because some of these changes are actually downgrades in pricing, that requirement is there, that you cannot bill for travel the way you used to from 1 July. So you are entitled to bill at the rates from 1 July. There's there's a window of understanding that some of the service agreements, if they don't have a rollover clause for indexation, will need to be negotiated. But even then, conversations have to happen with participants to explain your funding goes up by the exact same amount as our pricing goes up by, if that's the choice you're making. As I understand it, mid-July is the sort of accepted period for that to occur. And then, but effectively it's 1 July that your pricing should shift so that you can bill at the level that you need to bill, and then you have a little bit of a leeway to have those discussions. Now, I am not a lawyer. I keep saying other things I'm not, but that's the external auditor in me going caveat, caveat, caveat. There particular service agreements, particular areas may have really stringent conditions. It can depend, but my understanding broadly is that 1 July you can change your pricing. Bit of a window to have your negotiations. Some contracts already have the built-in roll forward clause for PAPL increases. So check your own service level agreement with and for participants, it's that understanding of this is happening. It's going to happen every year. We don't know what it will look like in the future, but if it continues in this format, there's going to be this indexation conversation on a regular basis. A lot of orgs, it just rolls super smoothly because they have it built in as an internal control. They're expecting it. But for some, as I said, they realize to their horror that they have been underbilling in what is already a lean service provision. So it's a really, it's an important one to check.
Yeah, and building that into the process on one hand, but also updating your systems then to reflect these changes. I know at ClickClaim, we've had providers that would have to manually update 10,000 service bookings. So we had to write a script that update that much more quickly. Matthew, how can sort of providers find a reliable way to sort of reflect these pricing shifts, directly in their rostering and sort of invoicing workflows?
Yeah, I guess this year we've been a little bit fortunate. We were even provided with a little bit more time than we were the year prior. I think last year, from memory, it felt like the changes came out on a Friday and they were due on the Monday.
Yeah.
I think that's right. Okay, cool.
Mhm.
We didn't get much time that weekend, but this time we were afforded a little bit more time. You know, obviously the key thing there is number one is to update all your price books to reflect those changes and double check that they have been updated, migrate them across. And as you mentioned, Tris, you've got to make sure that they apply to all future shifts moving forward. And you need to make sure you've done your checks and balances to make sure that if I've got shifts for Neil that start mid-July, that I have actually reflected that right price book change on his shifts moving forward. And ultimately, I've got to make sure that I'm billing correctly, but I've got to be paying my staff correctly as well. So there's a double-edged sword here.
Absolutely. And then, naturally, there are going to be some errors. We're updating systems, and I suppose, Siobhan, what might be some of those common errors that you see around this time? And are there sort of specific key things that people can do to avoid those errors?
My job as a consultant is I have the luxury of being able to sit back and spend hours reading this sort of stuff and just sitting down, and like I actually enjoy it because I'm sad like that. But to get into the nitty gritty of it and read it in full and do all of those things, and as an external auditor, design the programs to test that it is happening for our client base, for my external audit clients. But for providers, when you are running hard all year, trying to keep the doors open, dealing with the constant issues that just occur operationally, as they will when you work with people, to then be across all of this and the nuance of all of it, you need to lean into your software for this kind of stuff, I believe. But the key issues we find are just when you make a change, there's always the risk that you under or over. Like you're submitting invoices to a third party, to the NDIA, for checking. So there is a certain element of control that sits in there. But understatement is a risk because the NDIA is not going to pick that up. They're not going to pick up that, you're not actually billing as much for the services as you could be billing. And so from that point of view, it's always having the internal control to ensure and just self-check. So you're just testing. You take this a transaction that is really quite straightforward. For Allied Health, you would build specific controls in and around travel, in and around the variance on the rates. For standard services, it's just ensuring they have gone up by what they need to go up by. But I know from working with clients and CFOs, they're waiting for these with bated breath because you build your whole budget for the next financial year off what you think this indexation is going to be. So it's always a topic of conversation that's ongoing at this time of the year. I do have some sympathy. The NDIA have to wait for Fair Work to do their work on what the modern award uplifts will be before they can release the NDIS pricing uplift. So we're always going to have this very tight turnaround, when potentially they shift the model, maybe it will shift away from its linkage with Fair Work and the Modern Awards. I don't know. I don't see how. But this is just going to be part of doing business, this short proximity, and having it in your headline of internal controls, having it just there as the standardized way you do, and then leaning into technology and saying, can we just build a report that checks our masters? And then we can just go in and tick, 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 tick. As an external auditor, the checking of an automated process is always far more effective than using a manual process. They say anything that's manual is an 8% risk of error, and automated is a 1% risk of error, just off the bat, like generically. So my take is to just ensure that you have the capacity, either internally or systemically, to have this as a checks and balance that you do every 1st of August, so that you're not carrying anything through the year.
Yeah, perfect. And this, I suppose, then segues into a much broader conversation around sustainability more generally for providers. Matthew, what sort of are some of the ways, Siobhan mentioned some of the automations there. What are some of the ways that can providers automate how they sort of track utilization and productivity in real time to, then build off these platform changes?
Yeah, so I think what we're talking about there is just what's your billing rate for human capital? I think Siobhan's mentioned that, the benchmark's about 92% of my available staff hours should be billed. I think that was the correct number, right, Siobhan? One of the things we've been working at ShiftCare is the concept of human capital management utilization. And this gets really important around my full-time employees, my casuals, and part-time. I think we've spoken at length on other webinars about the need, and what we see across many providers is I've got a mix between full-time, casual, and part-time staff, and even contractors, because I don't know when my participant actually might have to go into hospital, and therefore I'm not able to bill for that person. So I can't be continuing to consume that human capital cost when my participant's in hospital. So I need to be able to ramp up or ramp down my workforce. So then what you've got is a natural challenge between not all of my workforce is contracted working 40 hours a week. So I need to understand, right, of my full-time workforce, what is at that 92% billable utilization, if not greater, but more importantly, who in my workforce are we underutilizing at least in a full-time capacity? Then I need to do the same about my part-times, my full-time, what's called permanent part-times. And I need to be able to see which ones of those permanent part-times are not working, we're not rostering on as many hours as we should do, so we're not getting the proper utilization out of them. So we're not utilizing our fixed human capital outgoings as well as we should do. Something that ShiftCare has been focused on for quite some time is illuminating that in one of our dashboards. Probably a couple of months ago, we launched the concept of human capital management in our dashboard. So you could see which staff were utilised and at what level of capacity, and it started at highest utilisation and all the way down. Now we're releasing something on Monday that will allow you actually to click on that box and bring up a report and actually interrogate that report based on time, staff, locations, etc., and actually extract that and analyse it to within an inch of its life. So the goal is, how can we provide our customers with much more information on how they're utilising their staff? Because the whole goal here is, if Neil's one of my workers, I want to make sure he's rostered on as much as possible from a billable perspective, and we're reducing those unbillable hours. So yeah, that's what we're really, really focused on, and that's what we will continue to focus on.
Yeah, perfect. It's interesting because at Quitclaim we're focused on the inverse in some ways in terms of the plan utilization for participants, making sure that the participants are using it at the right pace for their plan duration. So I think they both go very much hand in hand. One thing that's probably going to complicate this further going forward is the fact that as part of the paper, the NDIS has also proposed moving from what has been a one-size-fits-all pricing model to a differentiated model for specific types of support. Siobhan, this is a very open-ended question. What might this look like? What implications might this have for providers?
So it's one of the fundamental problems with the model. Look, I don't mind something being broken when I can see where it is. And that's the one great thing about the disability support worker cost model. It tells you where it's broken. So effectively, for everything except plan management, support coordination, and I believe capital, because it's the actual physical purchase of assets, you're driven by the same model. And that same model assumes you will hire the same SHADS level, so the same experience, the person with exactly the same experience to be supervised by someone with exactly the same experience. Your corporate structure will be exactly the same, and your service overhead, so the way your training, your workers' comp, all of those aspects to service, they're all going to be identical for someone who runs a SIL home, and for someone who runs a group, and then also for someone who runs employment. So it's abundantly clear that those service provisions are different, that the structures required to support them in terms of back end are different. And but one of the key complaints about the disability support worker cost model is that it is this one size fits all with only two levels of complexity, either high or standard. So having something that is a better fit for purpose can only be better. But what it will do, regardless of how wonderful it is, one, it will be delayed and late, because they always are. This is life. Two, you will have to adapt systems to change. You're going to have to change the way that you bill with a new system. So what we also see, I mean, we've got some evidence of what can happen when you go into further differential funding. In home care, which is a system and a segment, this is the provision of services into the home for an aged person. You have an intersection with the type and style of some of the services in the NDIS. They're governed by the same modern award, for example. So home care employees are paid under SHAD's Schedule E, as are some people within disability. That's a big red flag over here, and I'm not even touching that. But it's the same modern award, indicative of a similar service provision. In home care, they are shifting from 4 levels of funding for participants to 8. When you specify funding, what ultimately happens is it is often used as a lever to improve efficiency from the funder's perspective. So they are able to effectively get more services for their dollar because they are being more specific about where those dollars go. So in ways, what happened when shifted from block to individualized funding, and that's happened in home care from 15 to 17, 2015 to 2017, and it happened in disability when the NDIS was rolled out. You're going to effectively have a similar impact again. Efficiency drives, margins will become narrower because the field of funding will have, the aim is to reduce overspend by getting way more specific about what that spend is. So whilst it should solve issues and address the inequality of the disability support worker cost model, and we hope when they do that, they will also address some of the blatant errors in it. You're funded 1.5% for workers' comp under the current model. It's just not fit for purpose for a disability. It should be closer 3.5 to 5%. We're hoping it address some of the fundamental errors, but we hope as well it will address some of the inequalities in service provision in terms of funding more for more complex service provisions. Everyone's going to feel the pain with it. Efficiency is what they will always be looking for. We're never going to return to block funding. We're only ever going to get more and more focused in the funding envelope, and that means more and more efficiency. And I would die on the hill of utilisation. Incidentally, look, I work in professional services. I always have. And every time I talk about this, I call it the dark night of the soul, because it's horrible. I don't recommend it for anyone. I want my daughter to be a failed artist, whom I will support with my professional services income. But we have always focused on utilisation. That has been bread and butter. Now, at Stuart Brown, our own internal systems, they're not sophisticated when it comes to our own accounting systems. And we have been able to measure utilisation since I started in the firm 15 years ago, and they were measuring it 15 before that. So systems have got to recognise that utilisation will be the key to adapting to the reform changes that are coming. And just, we throw around terms sometimes. Utilisation, all it really means is how many hours of all the hours you spend at work working, how many of them are you billing? Utilisation doesn't factor in leave. You're removing it. But the model says it has to be 92%. So when you're at work, you need to bill 92% of those hours in order to meet the base level of the disability support worker cost model. So the ability to measure utilisation should always have been integral. It's even more now, though, because the margins are so tight, and with differential funding, they're only going to get tighter. They're not going to increase this funding envelope, I don't believe. We know that the outline cost, I think it's 45 billion, is the total scheme cost. They're controlling that moving forward. So the more efficient you can get in prep for what's coming, the better off you're going to be. And I feel that utilization, along with staff mix, along with efficiency. So efficiency is the ability to measure how much time are we spending in overtime, how many of our hours, hourly rate, are we paying at a rate that sits above the base, you know, from penalties, from overtime, from those things. So are we paying people who are too expensive? No, that doesn't factor quality. Park that. I'm just in from an accounting point of view. So are we paying people who are too expensive for the model? Are we paying them more hours at higher base rates because we're mismanaging overtime? And Matt, that point about using your casuals strategically and being able to measure that workforce factors into that efficiency bit around overtime, double time, penalties. And thirdly, are they billing for all the time that they should be? And that's your non face-to-face billables piece in there. The way you measure it is utilization. That's how you measure it. So yeah, I feel that any reforms that are coming, being able to measure where you are today will help you prepare for those reforms, because you're going to have to measure it in the future.
Yeah. You mentioned the margins in that 92% billable rate. Just to
Yeah.
reframe that in another context, I suppose, that 8%, right? What does that 8% mean? What do you do with that 8%? What's good practice?
Got to measure the hell out of it. That's what one part of it is. You've got to measure that 8%. Incidentally, I'm 90%. That's how tough that model is. It's 92, and professional services live in the 90% land. So we are kinder to our staff than you would be under a disability support worker cost model, which just doesn't sit. Like, we're accountants, we're not helping anyone, we're just causing problems. But yeah, 92%. So the 8 has to be team meetings, buddy shifts for new starters. That's why, again, measuring the casuals, measuring turnover, doing all those things, they indirectly feed into that 8% training. So that's both onboarding, but also, you know, regular structured training, and your team meetings are really important. So what you have is this double-edged sword of needing to reduce costs, but also knowing that structural changes in a workforce are going to shift that 8% up and down. It's going to modulate as you go through. So the ability to measure is extraordinarily important. You can't move the dial on something you can't see or break down. So buddy shifts, onboarding, training, meetings, that's really sitting in that 8%. Because remember, all forms of leave are not in there. They're before. You're funded for leave, except for additional shift workers leave, which is a little bit of a nuance I have a problem with. But you are funded for employees leave. But that 8% is training, buddy shifts, standard meetings, and yeah, anything else sort of non-billable that sits in there in that admin space for your frontline workers.
And moving into sort of, I suppose, the challenges that come with these transition periods with differentiated models or new papers, cash flow obviously tightens. That's just the reality of these transitions. So I suppose, I'll throw to you, Matthew, what sort of budgeting tools can providers have in place to sort of forecast and manage that risk at the sort of team level, service or team level?
Yeah, I think so I think there's a budgeting aspect in this, which is really done by your financial team, but you're going to need a buffer, as we move between pricing scenarios and maybe there's a delay in getting paid. You're going to need some form of cash flow buffer to sort of ride out those periods where you might not be getting paid. But if you look at some of the basic things, is what you want to be able to do is, as soon as I've finished a shift, I want to be able to get that to the appropriate NDIA and get that approved or not. I want to find out if there's any errors in that particular claim as soon as I possibly can. So partnerships with companies like QuickClaim and so forth really help to close that loop, because I want to find out about any errors as soon as I possibly can, and I want to stop them in all future billing. So the sooner I know about them, the sooner I get to resolve them. But if I'm waiting 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month, 6 weeks to find out about an error, and in the interim, I'm continuing to replicate that same error, I'm just throwing good money after bad. So, one of the things, I would urge everybody to do is, have you implemented, real-time paced product claiming? And if you haven't, you need to give some serious consideration to that, because it's about one, how do I reduce the friction for my poor accounts team? Because we know that can be a real pain in the backside, dealing with all the error rates, all the errors and so forth, and finding and just digging through that and having to go back to Shift to figure out what went wrong and was they claiming the right amount. You need to automate that where possible. So, talk to us, talk to Tris and the team at QuickClaim and figure that out, because the sooner I know about that, the sooner I can interject. The other one is to start looking at what margin am I going to generate from these particular clients. I need to be able to understand what services I should be offering and what shouldn't I be offering. Ideally, we need to get a little bit more ruthless about this, about like if I'm providing loss leading services, I need to be going into those forearmed, forewarned, and actually just ruthlessly saying, maybe I can't continue to subsidize that unless I'm a not-for-profit. And many of you on this call are actually for-profit organizations that are trying to create a sustainable business, providing a great service to participants, and you need to make a profit out of it. You have to give some real consideration to, do I continue to provide non-profitable services or unprofitable services where I'm making a loss on them? And just get really ruthless in that area. They're probably my biggest ones, Tris, to tell you the truth. Yes, I can do the budgeting and analyze all of that, but I need a short circuit the time from understanding when I've got an error. I need to reduce that from, maybe 3 weeks, a month down to days, if not hours, so I can quickly interject and stop making that same mistake again and again. And then I need to analyze. I need to ruthlessly look at, I can't continue to provide this service if it's unprofitable.
Yeah. And I suppose that there is like genuine angst and uncertainty amongst the sector arising from that. So I suppose it's empowering to sort of finish with, a direct call to action for everyone that's here on the webinar today. So I'll start with you, Siobhan, around what's sort of the one must do. You can go more than one if you want to, that providers need with pricing, claiming, and compliance. What's the one thing that they must look at?
With pricing, claiming, and compliance, I think being able to access data quickly. So you are paying your employees upfront, you're paying them every 2 weeks. You want your billing cadence to run as closely to that as possible so as you can manage your cash flow. The more information that you have on that, the better. The more you can project out so you can check to actual, the better. What you're trying to achieve is this ability to quickly understand your client profile and where your revenue should be. And the fact that you have this measure already of the shifts that are worked, the cost outlay, you should just have margins above and being able to see, well, where's my revenue and why is that down? The one great thing about the NDIA is once you've got over the hurdle of them approving the invoice and approving the claim, they pay very, very quickly. So they do actually pay, and they pay on time. The debtors days for NDIA are really low in comparison to, the market itself, like a private market. So there is that. I think the ability to see your data, that's all you need. And whatever form that comes in, it's the transparency of that, but also knowing it's on you to do that. Like, it isn't that long since block funding. This is relatively, in the scheme of the greater provision of services, this is a relatively new scheme. And that having to measure almost like just-in-time production in Japan. Remember we all learned about that in uni, just in time, and you were like, oh, I wonder what that magical thing is. And it is the same. You need to understand the proximity of your inputs and outputs and be able to measure them, because you need to predict immediately where it's going wrong. There is no margin for error in disability. There used to be with block funding. There is no longer there, and it's never coming back. So I think that understanding that whatever is thrown at disability providers with these reforms, the onus to be able to measure whether you are using your staff productively, whether you are maximizing your billing within the legal confines of the scheme, but whether you are maximizing your billing, the ability to see that on a day-to-day is where you need to get to. So I suppose, I mean, and governance and compliance, they are two also massive areas that are coming for this sector as well, like the ability to measure those, the outcomes from the Royal Commission. I firmly believe, and not just because I'm on a webinar with IT people and software people, I actually think the only way to measure that would be software as well. Like it's just, and this goes for every sector. It's not just, I mean, we're dealing with it in accounting, in audit, and all of those things, and and AI and the impact that's going to have on all of us. But I do feel your ability as business owners to see your data, that's everything. And to see that match between your wage and your revenue. And from the data, we can see generally 69, 72%. That's what that ratio should be for those top performers. See, that's what you're spending of your revenue profile. So yeah, I don't have an answer that's perfect for it, other than shifting the mindset that you can operate like a block funder. It's just, you cannot, and it's never going back. And just a point for the NFPs in the room as well. No one has margins, and nobody can be sustainable. What you can do with this service, what Matt mentioned about looking honestly at your service provision and figuring out whether you can continue, is to look at it and go, we have a mission, we want to support these people. How can we do that? You can only do it through data measurement, to go, well, these actually are profitable people in our participant profile. We can, we're efficient in this space, and we can cross subsidize for these plans that we know the NDIA have got wrong. But all of that can only work with data, and it can only work with data-driven decisions. So Tris, I don't think I actually answered that properly. I went all over the shop with it, but basically that's the only way. Data-driven decisions, whatever way you get that data, that is the only way forward, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I think that's a beautiful response, and I'll ask Matthew similarly, just around the one must do for providers with pricing, claiming, and
Yeah, I think there's a few for me, Tristan. One is obviously make sure you've updated your price list. So that's pretty straightforward. Obviously, review your service agreements, make sure you've updated those and communicated to those participants where you need to. Then the basics in this kind of process is not my cup of tea, but you've got to go into invoice auditing. So you've got to do spot checks to make sure you are invoicing correctly early. You don't want to find out later on that I've actually done it wrong. So you want to check against those key changes that have been made and make sure I'm invoicing the right amount, and get a separate pair of eyes to do that. Just double check. Then you don't have to figure it out like 3 months down the track when you go, oh, I've been over invoicing or under invoicing. The other one is, as Siobhan's mentioned, wages are traditionally 80% of our operating costs, if not greater. You need to make sure you've updated those correctly, but any kind of webinar is not a webinar unless we mention SHADs and payroll compliance, and making sure you're actually calculating your leave loading and your overtime and your superannuation correctly. If you have any form of doubt in that area, make sure you talk to Siobhan and the team or an auditor, and get someone to come in and just double check that you're paying correctly. It's better to check now than figure out later on that I haven't actually been calculating my leave, or I've been over calculating, overpaying. Then the other one is just continual quality assurance. Just continue to test that I'm paying my staff correctly and I'm billing my clients correctly. And then the other one is human capital. Human capital management is, I think you've heard that quite a lot here. The other thing we're really focused on ShiftCare, apart from human capital, is the concept of looking at the funds and forecasting where your participant funds are going to be in a particular period. We want to be able to tell you, that Tristram's funds are going to run into a zero balance in November. So that means, unfortunately, you're over servicing Tristram if that service agreement goes out to 31 December. We want to be able to tell you that. We also want to be able to tell you, actually, Tristram's going to have surplus funds on the 31st of September. Therefore, you might be under servicing Tristram. So we've got a release coming up shortly that'll be able to help you forecast that, align to service agreements, and also align to reoccurring shifts, just to make sure you've got all of that right and you're not miscalculating it, because there's a couple of different variables in that area. So yeah, that's my advice on what you should be looking at, and just a little bit of an insight into where we're headed here at ShiftCare as well.
Yeah, just to pick up on that from a participant perspective as well, I think that sometimes some providers that I've dealt with sometimes look at underutilization as something that's not actually damaging to the participant's plan, but it is as damaging as overutilization. I need to be using my funds as closely as possible to the pace that allows me to get through to the end of my plan, because that's the evidence that's been provided to the NDIA. Those are the funds that have been stated that I need. And if I'm to receive those funds in my next plan, it's important that I'm as close to that as possible. So yeah, sometimes I think we sort of look at underutilization as sometimes a murky thing, but it's as important to make sure that we're utilizing it as closely as possible.
Absolutely, and from a participant's point of view, there's a lot of angst around that, right? Like, I'm sure there's a lot of sleepless nights and so forth. So it's on us to provide better tools to our providers and also to our participants to provide them a lot more transparency.
Absolutely. Look, I could sit here and ask you a million more questions, both Siobhan and Matthew, but I want to give the opportunity to our attendees to take up that mantle and ask any questions they might have. So what I'm going to do now is throw back to Neil, who's been moderating the Q&A, and just to see if any questions have popped up based off of what we've been discussing. Over to you, Neil.
Yeah, they certainly have. So I've tried my best to answer as many of them as we've been going along, but I've got a couple that I'd love to chuck out to the panel. Siobhan, a lot of these are directed at you, so get ready for some quick fire. First one is, do we need to update client agreements, indicate new pricing? Start with an easy one.
I'm going to say yes, unless you have a specific clause in the agreement that speaks to this indexation being a regular occurrence or like an annual occurrence, that yes. The understanding is that they would be updated.
Yeah, definitely. And it's important to have that clause in your agreement so that when the pricing does get updated, you have the ability to do that.
Now, again, that's anecdotal, that clause for me. I've never gone in and legally tested whether that's specifically correct, but it's one to see, because it would just ease the pressure ever so slightly. You still have to have these conversations though. I mean, because it speaks to, again, if you don't have the conversation and there isn't that understanding, then potentially you're going to see that revenue utilization drop because people are going to be too concerned to engage with their plan.
That's actually a great segue into one of the other questions. What is the best way to approach communicating price changes to participants so their expectations are managed effectively? What strategies can you implement to ensure supports remain within participants' budgets under the new pricing?
So I probably shouldn't take that one, because mine would be, here is your new pricing from this accountant. So it's probably not going to be the best form of communication, but I suppose I don't have lived experience of having an NDIS plan. So I'm actually the worst person to answer that for both of those 2 points. But given my confidence, I probably will try and answer it anyway. But I should leave that open to people who are much better positioned than I.
Tris and Matt.
I'm happy to jump in there as someone who has been on the receiving end of such communication. I think the important thing to note is that the NDIA will often state that they will index our plans to accordingly adjust to the new pricing arrangements and price limits. That doesn't always happen as quickly as it should. So sometimes, even though you might be billing more, the participant won't have the funds to reflect to that change. So sometimes I think it's important to have an earnest conversation with the participant around, we're introducing these changes because, you know, cost of living inflation, particularly within the support worker model, you know, it's important that support workers are paid the right amounts, and communicate that to the participant, but also have perhaps a little bit of a leeway to make sure that their plans have been indexed accordingly. Sometimes it's not always the case, so I probably haven't answered that either, Siobhan, but I think
Better
it's
than me.
it's important to recognise that, yeah, the plans aren't always indexed. Talking to the participant to see whether they have been, and communicating the reasons why you're adjusting your PAPL rates accordingly. That is really important. That's communicated effectively.
Awesome. Thanks, Tris. I'll jump into another question here. Siobhan, you sort of answered this, but can you share a typical net profit ratio for a medium-sized NDIS provider? I need to benchmark myself.
You just encapsulate like 18 months of my life just then, like basically my job for a good while. So when we benchmarked and when we looked at 21, 22, 23 and 24, and when we do benchmarking is all about ensuring that you are categorizing and grouping orgs together so that they're actually comparable. So a $400 million org versus a $20 million org versus a $1 million org, they're going to have different cost structures. Incidentally, they're all funded the same, which again, differential model. So, and incidentally, it looks like the 1 million and the one-man band are going to be more easier to manage from a profitability point of view than the 400 million. So the idea that the larger orgs are doing better is actually fundamentally flawed. They are not. They are not doing better. They are suffering. And from the data, they are doing the worst. In terms of the size, I think in FY23, it was the 16 to 20 million benchmark that was making the only band. We call them bands. So we grouped them in based on their size. It was band 3, and there were 2 smaller bands below it. It was the only band making money. It was the only band making a positive margin. And I think it was something like, on average, $200,000 of a profit. FY24, none. All making losses. No differential in terms of there was no profit-making band. So when you would say your average sized organization, we find 20 to 30 million a very difficult spot to be in. It's very hard to make money because you're tipping into the size where everything's becoming a little more difficult to track. You need good systems, but you might not be able to potentially fund everything that's needed to bring them in. And then above that, yeah, things start to get worse. So it is actually, the data says there's no sweet spot, negative 3.5% margin across the board. And for those individual bands, it just kind of varies up and down from that, with a 6% negative margin for your band ones, the large organizations. So those large organizations, we group them from 60 million upwards to 300 million. That's that group. And they're on average negative 6% loss. There's one profit maker among them. So, and they're smaller. They're in the 60 to 70 million bracket. So to me, what it says is that because of the disability support worker cost model and the issues with it, there is no economy of scale in disability. So size doesn't really impact. What does is efficiency. It is all about efficiency. So when we look at those providers who actually do make a profit, it is not. There's no uniformity to them. So it's not that they're all non-SIL or that they're all SIL providers. It comes down to the individual culture in each of the organizations with regards to efficiency, their ability to drive performance. I've got one org that I know use data hugely to drive their casualization rate, to look at their overtime, to smart roster, and they pour heaps into their roster team in order to do that. So it isn't a case that the revenue profile, so medium size, is going to guarantee anything at all. But what we see on average across the whole thing, 67% making an operating loss across our benchmark, and that holds in the NDIS state of the sector. And it holds for Ability Roundtable, the other benchmarker in the space. We've got a lot of data there as well. And theirs, I think, was around 65% making losses. So yes, if you're making a profit, you're in the minority in disability. Ours was predominantly not for profit, so factor that in as well. But the takeaway that I have is, because the model is so lean and it's excruciatingly lean, like we unpacked it recently for laughs, and it's just, I've never seen anything like it. Like, if you ever played or seen people play that whack-a-mole game, you know, at a fairground, it's exactly that. So you get one thing nailed. So you nail your staff mix on shads, and you really have this great cohort sitting around 2.3, and you're supervised perfectly with your span of control. If their overtime goes off the charts, you're stuffed. If your workers' comp, you get one psychosocial claim, you're stuffed because it had to be at 1.5%. Your corporate footprint needs to match the model exactly. 12% of your frontline worker cost. That's what your corporate cost has to be. And then services 22. So that's sort of the in-between. So I actually tried to answer that in the chat and in my usual accounting robotic way. But there's so much more nuance to it. And I suppose from me, I would take a step back and go, it's actually not about what my revenue size says my bottom line should be. It is about, what is my utilization, what is my corporate structure, my service overhead, my span of control, my staff mix, my overtime cost, what's my workers' comp, and how am I measuring to that 92% model? Because the model only funds, this is everyone being perfect, because it's built on the top 25% of a population we don't even know what it was based on, but top 25% of something. It only gives you a 2% margin, even if you got all of those. So, long way around to an answer. If you're making a profit, well done. You're in the minority. Keep at it. But those who we're seeing making profits, we're seeing them ebb slowly away each year. But focus on your utilization, 92%. That should be the number that you're looking at, because everything else will flow from that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Yvonne. There's a ton of amazing questions in there, and we will collate all of these and try and answer all of them and share them in a document after the webinar. Unfortunately, we're out of time now, but thank you so much for everyone that's joined. Thank you so much, Trish, Siobhan, Matt, for hosting this. There's been some great comments and great questions, and hopefully everyone at home got a lot out of this. And yeah, we'll follow up with the questions, and we'll share the recording once this is all done.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. Awesome. Have a good Thursday. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
All the best. Cheers.
Bye.